Well, welcome to the Prince's Foundation School of Traditional Art lecture series. This is the second lecture sponsored by Aramco, so we're very grateful to Aramco for allowing us to invite Dr Samir Mahmoud from Beirut, and he's flown in specially. The first time he's come to lecture at the school, so we're very happy about that, and hopefully not the last. I first met Samir with the renowned, I have to say, Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad Winter in Cambridge, who is Professor of the Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge, which is where Samir gained his PhD. And I presume Abdul Hakim was your supervisor? Yes, one of your supervisors. So it's a very erudite dynasty that he's coming from. So the focus of Samir's research in Cambridge was aesthetics in Ibn Arabi. And Dr. Mahmoud has won numerous awards from the University of South Wales, which is where you're from originally?
University of South Wales, Sydney, yes.
Sydney, yes. And from Cambridge as well. And his publications include The Space of Soul Towards a Phenomenology of Sacred Space. Also, Guardians of Biocultural Diversity. And From Heidegger to Suhrawardi, an introduction to the thought of Henri Corbin, which is published on the official website of Corbin. I've also, I have to say, I've listened to his lecture, as many of you may have done, on YouTube, which is on colour symbolism and the mystic quest. And if you haven't, I highly, highly recommend it. Dr. Mahmoud has worked also as a researcher at the Australian Museum in Sydney, designer at Civitas, an urban design and architecture firm based in Sydney, and has taught courses in Cambridge at the Centre for Muslim-Jewish Relations. And he is now currently Assistant Professor of Architecture at the Lebanese American University in Beirut, and continues his studies and research on the phenomenology of architecture, space and the senses, and Islamic art and architecture. He also, because his family live in Sydney, so Samir travels often to Australia, where he has several projects. One of them, it sounds extremely interesting, called Living Turath, where he encourages thinking with the Islamic tradition rather than about, which, as I was saying to him, is slightly parallel to what we do at the Prince's School. It's practicing the traditional arts and architecture as opposed to learning about them. So we hope to be able to keep them alive, as Samir is keeping alive Turath. And one other thing, he's also developing a liberal arts course there, so he's extremely busy. And we are about to see his... This happens every time. Sorry. Thank you. Oh, we haven't got the title up there. But the title is Islamic Aesthetics, an interrogation, or interrogation and approaches. So I've been giving Samir a bit of a hard time about the word aesthetics because in the way we look at it, if we look at it at all at the Prince's School, it tends to have rather derogatory meaning because it's all about surface decoration. However, I think Samir is going to give a completely different view and a much more enlightening view. So please welcome Dr. Samir Mahmoud.
Thank you, Emma, for a very generous introduction. Okay. Maybe if I move this here, it might work better. Is this better? Hello? Yeah? Okay, all right. Thank you for coming. The title is Islamic Aesthetics, ? Approaches and Explorations. And the first part of this talk, I want to really briefly introduce you to the very notion of aesthetics itself, how it developed, but also how it's become a part of contemporary discourse on Islamic art and architecture, drawing mainly on a number of contemporary scholars who have, to a certain extent, appropriated this term. That's why it's called an introduction and a proposition. So, Plato once wrote in the Symposium that if there is anything worth living for, it is to behold beauty. And this notion of beauty for Plato covers more than just the issue of shapes, colors, proportion, and harmony. It also includes, of course, psychological and social aspects, characters, political systems, virtues, and truths. It included not only things which are a joy to see and hear, but everything which causes admiration, arouses delight, and brings enjoyment. Although beauty was beheld and appreciated subjectively, it was largely an objective aspect of reality. And that's very important to bear in mind in this definition of beauty for Plato and for most of the Mediterranean, what I call the Mediterranean tradition, which includes, in later antiquity, the Islamic tradition. But to what end? For none other than to behold the supreme beauty of the good or the divine that transcends its worldly manifestations. Plato's notion of beauty was very broad and included moral and cognitive values. And this wasn't a personal opinion of Plato. It was widely shared by many other Greek philosophers, Christian philosophers, and early Muslim philosophers. However, when we turn to the question of beauty today, when we discuss the issues of art, architecture, and what we often mention or discuss it, we tend to associate with the notion of aesthetics. But etymologically speaking, the notion of aesthetics in Greek means things perceptible by the senses. And therefore, aesthetics, etymologically speaking, has nothing to do with beauty or art as it has been understood. However, there have been a number of developments, of course, in the past few centuries that have brought the field of aesthetics into a separate field of philosophical investigation, especially with Baumgarten and Kant, where aesthetics means things perceptible by the senses, particularly beautiful objects that seem to arouse a certain sense of joy and delight. And therefore, aesthetics initially, that had nothing to do with beauty or art per se, has become associated in philosophical discourse with the very notion of beauty and art. It was popularized in English and as a translation of Immanuel Kant's work, and largely by the 19th century it became a term often associated with art for art's sake, whereby aesthetics became merely preoccupied with the subjective manner in which beauty is experienced. As such, it's a notion with firm roots in a specific Western cultural context. I'm going to keep track of time so I don't go over the 45 minutes. Okay, so by the 19th century also, a number of developments were happening in the Arab world, and as many scholars like Biran Abu Saif and Oliver Lehman, who work in the field of beauty in Islamic thought, have pointed out, by the 19th century, there are many scholars working on translating this notion of aesthetics into Arabic as ilm al-jamal, but it's an artificial translation of a term that never existed prior in the Arabic language. It's really a translation of a Western term that has no equivalent in the Arabic tradition. In the entry to this particular definition of ilm al-jamal, which is mentioned and listed in the Encyclopedia of Islam, the author, Kahwaji, writes that a general theory on aesthetics and precise definitions for the terms used in this field are lacking in the history of Arabic civilization. Therefore, if aesthetics is understood as a theory of art or beauty for its own sake, then the medieval Islamic mentality or medieval Islamic thought yielded no comparable aesthetics. And if indeed aesthetics is a cultural, intellectual development peculiar to the West, then it is no surprise that Islam has no equivalent term. Coining neologisms like ilm al-jamal or Islamic aesthetics may be anachronistic, and the scholar can either abandon all use of the term or else engage with it critically. Now, some have abandoned the use of the term or criticized it by suggesting, as Kumaraswamy has wonderfully expressed it, whereas almost all other peoples have called their theory of art or expression rhetoric and have thought of their art as a form of knowledge. We have invented, i.e. we moderns have invented a term aesthetics and think of art as a kind of feeling. Insofar as art has become preoccupied with human sentiments and feelings, it has substituted psychological explanations for the traditional conception of art as an intellectual virtue and of beauty as pertaining to knowledge. Now, Coomaraswamy's quote here really summarizes the traditional pre-modern understanding of art and everything associated with art and beauty as an intellectual exercise linked to knowledge and eventually linked to knowledge of the divine. And while I agree with this metaphysical posture of Ananda Coomaraswamy, I have opted for a second approach, that of critically engaging with the term for two main reasons, really. One, as a professor or assistant professor who teaches a lot of students, I find it's a lot, from a pedagogical point of view, it's a lot more effective if one accepts the term as it is widely used already among students and among scholars, and critically engage with it, because a lot of people have no understanding of what the pre-modern understanding of art or architecture or aesthetics or any of its terms associated with it really means in pre-modern thought. And it's a lot easier and a lot more effective, I think, pedagogically speaking, to critically engage with the term and see how far we can go with it, and then juxtaposing contrary or contrasting or analogous ways of viewing the world with it. And so the second reason is really because the field of aesthetics today has really opened up a field of investigation that allows a scholar to investigate and inquire into areas and ask questions that the discipline of art, contemporary art and architecture, or at least Islamic art and architecture, does not allow for. So, for example, issues that have to do with particular sensibilities, how particular cultures experienced or understood or engaged with categories of the beautiful or art and architecture. These are often ignored in contemporary monographs on Islamic art and architecture. And because of the lack of strong links between text or visual culture and particular monuments, it's very difficult in the field of Islamic art and architecture to really establish this link between a certain aesthetic sensibility and a particular monument. But by carving out a separate field of aesthetics and visual culture, as it is called today, one is able then to inquire, raise questions about how certain cultures or certain people at a particular time understood certain issues related to this particular topic, as opposed to linking it to particular monuments. And I'll explain that as I go along. And this has been done quite successfully in several other fields. The author of the Encyclopedia of Islam entry goes on to say in the same quote or the same definition that nevertheless it is possible to trace in Arabic Islamic thought certain features common to the elements of aesthetic emotion and to their formal expression. So can we speak of an Islamic aesthetics? Yes and no, not really. However, the correlata, the whole host of issues and terms that we often associate with aesthetics, like pleasure, form, perception, creativity, art, color, harmony, proportion, and imagination, all received their fair share of discussion and theoretical reflection in the Islamic tradition. So although the subject of aesthetics wasn't a separate field of investigation, the terms we often associate today with aesthetics did receive their own theoretical reflections. And the key really is to explore how and in what context these elements and these terms were discussed. Emma referred to a talk I gave a few years ago on color, and in that talk I really tried to show how color has been understood within a certain kind of mystical text and how it's often been associated with a certain degree of spiritual quest towards God. But there are many other contexts for discussing color, for example. And so this wonderful quote here I find very useful. The fact that the medieval authors, and here De Bruyn is talking about European authors, but it can be equally applied to medieval Islamic authors. The fact that the medieval authors did not develop a systematic theory of the arts does not mean that they were not aware of the relationship between art and beauty. For example, if we understand aesthetics to refer to a wide range of issues connected with beauty, then yes, indeed, medieval Islamic thought did have, quote-unquote, aesthetic theories. However, these theories were enmeshed in theological, philosophical, jurisprudential discussions or within wider intellectual contexts, literature, optics, alchemy, etc., etc. Never as a sui generis topic in any modern sense. The precise nature of beauty depends on the author, the period we're looking at, the school of thought under consideration, the discipline, etc., etc. Likewise, if we understand aesthetics to refer to issues of an artistic nature, here again we find the medieval Islamic tradition replete with discussions and references to art, craft, creativity, and what we often refer to as aesthetic pleasure. However, there is no art for art's sake, and it must be understood that the realm of aesthetics was much larger than it is today, and our investigation must take this broader perspective into consideration. Another interesting quote that I find really helps me think through these issues is one by Umberto Eco in his wonderful book on art and beauty in the Middle Ages. We must look for the ways in which a given epoch solved for itself aesthetic problems as they presented themselves at the time to the sensibilities and the culture of its people. Then, and only then, our historical inquiries will be a contribution not to whatever we conceive aesthetics to be, but rather to the history of a specific civilization from the standpoint of its own sensibility and its own aesthetic consciousness. And therefore, again borrowing another quote from Umberto Eco, this time his study on Thomas Aquinas, which is a wonderful study on beauty and aesthetics in the work of Aquinas. The problem of the possible, we can define aesthetics now if we want to, with its working definition, if you will. The problem of the possible objective character and the subjective conditions of what we call the experience of beauty. It thus refers also to all problems connected with the aesthetic object and aesthetic pleasure. Again, this is just a working definition because it helps organize the investigation and structure the scholar's work. According to this definition, any scholarly investigation into aesthetics in Islamic thought must take as its starting point the category of the beautiful and then follow it wherever the discussion or conversation leads. And this lecture will be an attempt to demonstrate or show how, by using a working definition like this or by critically engaging with the term aesthetics, how it can be beneficial in the process of exploring the correlata or the terms we often associate with aesthetics. But we need not necessarily hang on to the term aesthetics by the end of the investigation, because by the end we'll realize that we have to constantly broaden and broaden and broaden and broaden and expand our understanding of what aesthetics is, up to a point where the contemporary definition of aesthetics no longer holds. And then the interesting question then becomes, what comes of this notion of aesthetics? So, I have devised a number of different approaches to the Islamic sources, and I'm going to try to explain each one gradually. But it is important to bear in mind something that many scholars have pointed out before, that the sources of Islamic aesthetics in classical Islamic thought are not systematic treatises as we can find in the Western tradition. We don't find the Vitruvius in the Islamic tradition, nor the very informative debate or discussion between Abbas Sugar and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Valerie Gonzalez and many others have pointed out this issue. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why we don't find these kind of detailed discussions in defense or in favor of particular understandings of or polemics is because very early on I think Islamic tradition quickly defined its orientation. It banned the figural representation in mosques. It established a number of parameters that I think were widely accepted largely in the later Islamic tradition. And the Islamic tradition was then spared very polemical, yet in retrospect very informative discussions on Islamic art and architecture. The controversy between Trigger and the Cistercian monk Saint Bernard, or the iconoclastic controversy in Byzantium, has left us with a very rich textual sources. But the Islamic tradition didn't really have these kind of really hot-heated debates throughout most of its history. specifically pertaining to the question of art and architecture. And so, unlike Christianity, which inherited most of the Hellenistic culture, Islam really avoided most of the literary and cultural productions of Greece, such as art and literature. It wasn't Homer who was translated into Arabic, but people like Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. And most of the classical texts in the Islamic tradition that classify the sciences reveal a lack of a chapter or section dedicated to beauty or aesthetics. For example, the first classifier of the sciences in Islam, Al-Kindi, placed architecture and music in the chapter on mathematics, whereas today they would merit sections of their own under title aesthetics, for example. Other classifiers of the sciences, like Ikhwan al-Safa, Ibn Sina, Ghazali, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, many of the early philosophers, you find few scattered references here and there to topics that we would often associate today with aesthetics, but never a separate chapter, which suggests that it wasn't really a subject of separate interest in and of its own. What further complicates the scholarly search is the fact that a significant amount of the Islamic heritage is still languishing in manuscript form in libraries across the Islamic world. A little known fact that a lot of people who are not really specialists in Islamic studies probably don't know is that most of the Islamic tradition, a lot of the Islamic tradition is still in manuscripts. What has been published in Arabic is only partial or part of the wider Islamic tradition. And what's translated into English is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that. And so you can imagine what would happen if a lot of the manuscripts were finally edited and published in Arabic or Ottoman, Turkish or Persian, made available to a wider scholarly community and then made available in other languages. It would give us a broader picture of the medieval Islamic tradition. And so any perspective we can give right now is really a partial one. However, in order to help us organize our thoughts, I've classified the approaches to three main ones. The first three, we can approach the Islamic sources by looking at a particular discipline or school of thought. We can approach through a particular author, or we can choose a particular theme. The last two are more recent ones, and I'll explain them when I get to them, more contemporary approaches, and what I propose is a more nomadic approach. So if we look at the separate discipline, for example, of Islamic philosophy, we can really discover what is called, or what we could call, an Islamic philosophical aesthetics. And it would start with the Neoplatonic distinction between intelligible beauty and sensible beauty. It can delve into the nature of love, which is discussed at length in philosophical diction. We can talk about proportion and harmony to a certain extent, which is covered, and the nature of geometry. And the last one, the nature of geometry, has received the least attention for some bizarre reason. But in later Neoplatonic thought, there were really interesting speculations on the nature of geometry and the mathematical object, which found their way into the Islamic tradition and were elaborated upon. But to the best of my knowledge, no one has really published anything on this particular subject in early Islamic philosophy and the nature of geometry. What I mean by the nature of geometry is, what is the ontological status of the geometric object and the mathematical object? When you do geometry on paper, you often think that you're doing a sensible physical drawing. That's not how a lot of late Neoplatonists and early Islamic philosophers actually saw the nature of geometry. Geometry was an imaginal object, as it were, that was suspended between the idea, which can never be articulated. So you might articulate the one as a dot, and you can find individuals that are one person, one thing, but the dot itself as a geometric object is in between these two realms. Even though you physically draw a dot or you draw a geometric pattern on a canvas or on a piece of paper, the ontological status of that, what you're looking at, is neither physical nor intelligible. And that's a very interesting discussion that I think can really shed a lot of light on the nature of geometry itself. So now this pursuit of philosophy, Islamic philosophical aesthetics, is quite easy up to the period of Ghazali. But Islamic philosophy subsequent to Ghazali, especially under the influence of Ibn Arabi and Suhrawardi, fuses mystical ideas with theological ideas, and philosophy takes and assumes a very different form, which includes mystical intuition as a means of knowing the world and knowing God. A lot of work needs to be done in this field. Thus, an Islamic philosophical aesthetic will be a much needed contribution to the history of philosophical aesthetics in general also. Another school of thought perhaps is a mystical one that may yield mystical aesthetics, and one can circumscribe or define this mystical aesthetics roughly or associate it with the Sufi tradition, but one can make an argument for the existence of a discipline or school of thought or tendency within Islamic thought called mystical, and one would then be inclined to explore issues of the nature of the imagination, for example, the relationship between reality and illusion. These are topics and themes that seem to pop up again and again in their writings. Oliver Leaman, I think, several years ago in his book on an introduction to Islamic aesthetics, attempted to tease out an Ishraqi aesthetics as an aesthetics based on the writings of Suhrawardi, the philosopher of illumination. So one can make a case for a mystical aesthetics based on several themes and sub-themes. Given the Sufi preoccupation or the mystical preoccupation with divine love as the leitmotif for creation and the cosmos as the manifestation of divine beauty, mystical texts provide the richest source of aesthetic reflections and writings available in the Islamic tradition. To give you but one example of such approach or one such theme that often pops up again and again in many of these writings, I've come across a lot of writings on the nature of the imagination and the image and the nature of human creativity, with profound psychological, spiritual, and cosmological reflections. In the mystical literature, there's an extended meditation on the nature of the image. We live in an age saturated by images. We're surrounded by images. We rarely really reflect on the ontological status of these images. But there are many schools of thought today that are beginning to really reflect on what it means to live in an age saturated by images and illusions. From Walter Benjamin up to Lacan and many others later, there is this reflection on the nature of the image. But in an age in which images weren't really readily available, imagine you're living in the Middle Ages, you're not surrounded by images anywhere, everywhere. Rather, the only access to images you had is either in your imagination or your perception of things around you or in works of art and architecture. Yet there are profound reflections on the nature of the image and the ontological status of different kinds of images. And here I'm juxtaposing two images here, if you will, or two contexts of meditation or prayer, in which on the left you have an icon, of course, and on the right you have a mihrab, which is supposed to indicate, or niche to indicate the direction of Mecca. But in both instances there are images, and there are reflections on the nature of image. And in many of these writings you find this discussion of also as if images, and as if image is image of seeing something as if it's something else. And so in both instances, whereas the icon seems to be clearly present in the actual physical form, on the right-hand side in the niche, though no physical image is there, it's paradoxically populated by an infinite variety of images from the imagination. Right? So this discussion between the physical and the imaginal figures a lot in these mystical writings, and the relationship between each one and the other, and the nature of imagination itself. Another interesting field of exploration that I've come across in several mystical texts is the notion of creativity. To what extent is a human being creative, and to what extent do human beings participate in divine creativity? And I think the Islamic prohibition on creating physical images or images of living beings like animals and creatures and human beings stems from a profound philosophical reflection on the nature of human creativity. To just give you an example, in several sources I found the following discussion. You bring a stone, ashlar stone, that hasn't been worked yet, and you start carving a vine or an arabesque into it, especially a vine, a plant form. And I have in mind here also a lot of the insights of Art Nouveau, Ruskin, 19th century reflections on the nature of the vegetal in art. What the artist actually does to the stone, according to some of the sources I've been reading, especially in the mystical context, is transforms or elevates the minerality of the stone to the level of vegetal life. And they describe it as endowing or giving life, vegetal life, to stone. Right? This is the context of the discussion. But, of course, a human being who possesses human soul can't grant another object a human soul, but he can grant lower form of a soul, which is the vegetal soul or the mineral soul. But the way in which it is discussed is quite remarkable, because it discusses the living nature of reality, from the smallest pebble to ultimate cosmos, as all living entities, all possessing some degree of life. And working the hand with the stone increases its degree of life and elevates it ontologically. I found that very paradoxical when I was reading it. But any artist who's ever worked with stone and carved stone, especially into some kind of a twisting plant form, understands what I'm saying when you say that you're really ennobling the stone with something of yourself. In any case, I'm not going to dwell too long on this particular issue, but I just want to show the richness of these kind of reflections that are found in context that you would never expect. This whole discussion is in the context of prayer. It has absolutely nothing to do with art. But the author is talking about creativity of the artist in the context of the creativity of prayer. This is just one example of many to show that the scholar who's working in the field of Islamic aesthetics, if you want to call it, has to really rummage through so many different sources to get even a faint idea of what the medieval tradition was actually talking about and reflecting on when it talked about these issues. Another very promising area of research is Islamic theology. That's a separate discipline, of course. One could go through the Islamic sources on Islamic theology and come up with a unique, let's say, Islamic theological aesthetics. I'll give you one example only, just to illustrate the point. There's one particular argument constantly made in theological sources about proof of God. But paradoxically, this one isn't really one that presents detailed scientific arguments or rational proofs, but one that's really, for want of a better term, one could call the argument from aesthetic contemplation, i.e. the idea of contemplating the very nature of the natural world itself and its beauty as a means of effectively convincing the person that the cosmos has a creator. And this is really based on the several Quranic verses that turn the attention of the reader towards the contemplation of the night and day, mountains, the heavens and the earth, the winds, the sky, the water, etc. One such theologian, Razi, for example, explains that the Quran contains at least 8 types of evidence, or loci of contemplation, as he calls it. The human body, the human psyche, animals, plants, minerals, seas, mountains, elements, etc. He lists 8 categories of different kinds of natural phenomena in which one finds the contemplation of the natural world leads to the divine. What's so interesting about this particular perspective is it's grounded in an empirical epistemology whereby the theologian presents physical, theological proof for knowing God through our senses, through our reason also, and through our entire being. And this notion of the entire being is really important because it's not an argument based on rational proof alone, although it does contain it, but one in which the affective and the intuitive play a fundamental role. It's not merely about being rationally swayed by the argument, but also effectively convinced by the design itself and being moved by the utter beauty of the cosmos itself. And one finds in several of Ghazali's reflections, one on the beauty of a tree, which reminds me of almost like a romantic sensibility, really, where he describes the tree as which stands there with its roots deep in the earth to absorb water, its branches, leaves, and fruits nurtured thereof, the earth a nurturing mother on whose bosoms the branches and leaves suckle. For him, this is irrefutable proof that the divine is and permeates all that is. I'm not going to get any deeper into this particular argument, but one could call it the argument from beauty to distinguish it from any other theological arguments for the existence of God. There are also many, many other arguments in Islamic theology related to the divine attributes. Of course, Islamic theology distinguishes between two type of attributes or divine names, the names of beauty, the names of majesty, and it sees the entire fabric of the universe consisting of the interweaving of these two, the manifestation of these two divine names or their traces in existence, which, for want of a better expression, really one can see as a remarkable image or vision of beauty in the cosmos. There are other arguments also from Islamic theology, if one wants to continue with this line of thought. Yasser Tabbah, many years ago, in his book on the Sunni revival, particularly focusing on the year 1000 in Baghdad, located the origins of the Muqarnas in an interesting Islamic theological debate about the nature of matter and the nature of the universe. And he found support for this, Muqarnas being it's both a structural and an aesthetic device, or a structural and non-structural device. But what's interesting about the visual structure of the Muqarnas, in the way it creates these wonderful individual cells, is that it parallels the theological argument about the nature of reality. Muslim theologians debated at length the question of God's involvement with the universe and creation, and they rejected the Aristotelian idea that somehow God, at the beginning of time, created the universe according to a certain number of laws and then sat back and watched like a clockmaker. In the Islamic tradition, this doesn't make any sense. Divine doesn't create the universe in this particular way. It doesn't sit back and watch. Rather, the divine is constantly creating and recreating the world every instant. And so the very existence of God, the very existence of the universe, depends at every instance on the divine being, and everything comes into being, and then it's withdrawn, and then it comes into being, and it's withdrawn, and it comes into being at every instant. And therefore, what holds the universe together and what underpins the natural laws of physics or the natural laws of the cosmos that we see with our physical eyes or we can study with our reason is the remarkable will of God that holds it all together. But otherwise, the universe will cease to exist. Now, for Muslims, an omnipotent God can only be an omnipotent God if he is constantly, at every instant, infinitely, always involved with the cosmos itself. There are ramifications for this idea of creation, which we can talk about a little bit later. But this particular theological difference with the Greek thinkers and philosophers led to a particular way of looking at, or atomistic or occasionalist view of the universe, that where the universe consists of these atoms that are, though the laws of physics hold it together, are underpinned by and glued together by the will of God. An image really to convey to you this idea of creation and recreation at every instant is the TV screen. You watch movies every day, we all do. We see moving images on the screen, but our eye doesn't really catch the constant flickering of the pixels that underpin the constant images. So we see constancy. We see constant images, we see movement, we see a single image remaining the same from second to second. What we don't see, what our eye is not able to actually pick up on, is the constant flickering. So at every instant, the image disappears and appears, disappears and appears, disappears and appears. Our eye doesn't really see it. Our eye sees the image continuing. Okay? And so this is, if it wasn't for the invention of TV, I wouldn't have no idea how to actually convey this image to you. So, but that's the closest I can really get to conveying this idea of creation and recreation of the universe. And it's a remarkable, really remarkable theological perspective on the nature of reality. And, these are a few images here on different kind of muqarnas found in... The theological aesthetics can be defined then, if we want to define it here, according to this separate discipline. It's concerned with questions about God and issues in theology in the light of beauty found in the natural world. So a theological aesthetics is really about the kind of aesthetics related to how God expresses himself or is perceived in the natural world. Of course, there are many other possible schools of thought or disciplines, if you will, like literary aesthetics, which would take us into another domain altogether. There are many other also optics, for example, is another one that's received a lot of attention lately in the writings of Abdul Hamid Sabra and my colleague in Lebanon, Nader al-Bizri, who's written a lot on vision and perception, and a field of research that's quite promising. It's taken up recently by Hans Belting in his book Florence and Baghdad, Renaissance Art and Arab Science, in which he asked the question, why didn't perspective develop in the Islamic tradition, even though it's based on the optics of Ibn al-Haytham? And he has this to say, it's quite interesting really. In the Islamic world, geometry became a symbolic form by being a subject of representation, as opposed to a tool for representation, as in the West. And throughout the book, he really juxtaposes two aesthetic systems, or two ways of viewing the world when he compares Renaissance and Baghdad. Baghdad here sitting in for the Islamic tradition. Also tangential to some of these discussions, oniric writings on dreams, alchemy, literary aesthetics, dictionaries. They have a lot of interesting insights to give us on the nature of how certain authors or certain people saw and defined terms over several generations. One interesting also subdiscipline, if you will, that I'd like to elaborate on a little bit here is that of a pseudo-medical body of literature, first pointed out by Thomas Arnold in his book Painting in Islam, but didn't really elaborate on it. I took up a thread from that book and followed it up until I came across an author who lives only 40, or used to live 40 miles away from where I live right now. Because the importance of beauty and its psychosomatic effects were thoroughly explored in the medieval medical tradition, particularly in regards to melancholia, huzn. In the Shifa, for example, Ibn Sina discusses the causes, the symptoms, and the cures for melancholia. This is a field of investigation that started with Aristotle and then moved on with Rufus of Ephesus and Galen, at which point it found its way into the Islamic tradition, and Richard Burton in the 19th century in England. The impact of Ibn Sina on these issues was quite profound, and it led to a proliferation of another body of literature that revolved around the benefits of the hammam, the bath. This is where the link is found, because there's this pseudo-medical literature on the effects, how can we cure, make people happier, what leads to sadness, and then the literature on the hammam for psychological and physical well-being. What's of interest to the student of medieval beauty in this body of literature is the extent to which the writers expound and explain upon the benefits or beneficial effects of beauty on the soul. Now, the hammam tradition, the bath tradition, starts with the Romans. It has a long history. In the early Umayyad period, you may know that many of the qusur, the Umayyad qusur, like Qusayr Amra and Shatta palace, had a lot of figurative images inside the hammams, which seems odd within the context of Islamic tradition, but the Umayyad period really belongs to the early experimental, if you want to call it experimental phase, or according to recent historiography, late antiquity. But by the Abbasid period and onwards, hammams ceased to have, to the best of my knowledge, figurative images, and they substituted with patterns and colors. Now, what's so interesting about this is that you find a lot of references to walls, the colors used. One author, writing in about 1000 of our common era, for example, Hilal al-Sabi', estimated that Baghdad at its height had about 60,000 bathhouses. Of course, he is exaggerating, perhaps, but it does show the importance of the grandeur of Abbasid capital, and also the importance of hammams in Islamic culture. Roughly coinciding with the peak period in bath construction, from around the 11th to the 13th, and then the 13th to the 17th century, we have a number of works that discuss the benefits of baths, including gazing upon colored walls and frescoes. What's of interest is the explicit manner in which the beauty of the building was the object of discussion, for none other than the joy and happiness that it brings to the soul. For example, one medieval author from the 13th century, Badr al-Din ibn Mudaffar, the Qadi of Albak, wrote a treatise titled Mufarrih al-Nafs, the Gladdener of the Soul. Now what's important about Ibn Qadi al-Balbaki, or Badr al-Din ibn Mudaffar, was that he was a student of Muhazzib ad-Din Abi Muhammad Abdul Rahim bin Ali bin Hamid, otherwise known as Ad-Dikhwar, head physician of Egypt and the Levant, and teacher at the Bimaristan al-Nuri in Damascus. And he later, Ibn Nafis also, a very famous medical doctor, was also a student of his, but Ibn Mudaffar ibn Qadi al-Balbak, the author I'm talking about, he later succeeded his teacher as the head of the school in Syria, and he supervised, or under his administration, the Bimaristan al-Nuri was expanded. Now you have an author here who's writing a book on what brings joy to the soul, and who's under his administration, the Hammam is expanded. And the hospital is expanded, including many of the structures within. And then in the text, he begins a discussion with what brings the soul happiness and joy, and what wards off sorrow and despair. And in the book, he discusses psychological aspects and physical aspects. He starts with the 5 senses, each one with a dedicated chapter, and then he moves on to the medicine, foods, bodily movements, and the inner senses. He concludes the book by exhorting the reader to allow joy to enter the soul from as many senses as possible simultaneously, so as to multiply the effect upon the soul. And in one of his chapters, he has this to say about the sense of sight. The soul is gladdened by the sight of objects whose color is red, green, and yellow, and white. These bring ease to the soul and pleasure to the heart and quicken the mind. They relax the faculties and expand the breast or the spirit, because they are bright colors like the soul, which is luminous and consists of light, which explains why it is inclined towards that which is like it. Light is loved. Just consider your joy, dynamism during the day, and lack thereof during the night. Then he goes on to explain issues related to melancholia, anxiety, sorrow, and all the other qualities or psychological aspects associated with darker colors. And then he goes on to say, ask, what of man-made beauty? Ibn Muzaffar goes on, all physicians, sages, and wise men are agreed that the sight of beautiful pictures gladdens and refreshes the soul and drives away from it melancholy thoughts and suggestions. And then he continues, and this is the quote I have here on there. Some say if a sight of an actual beautiful object is not possible, then let the eyes be turned towards beautiful forms of exquisite workmanship, pictured in books, in noble edifices, or lofty castles or baths. And then he quotes Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi expressing strongly the opinion when in a beautiful picture harmonious colors such as yellow, red and green are combined with due proportion, they have a certain kind of effect on the soul. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but you can get where it's going. In the text he reproduces the classical philosophical distinction between different levels of the soul, the mineral, the vegetative, the animal soul, and the rational soul, and above that the spiritual. And then he suggests that different aspects of the soul require different kinds of pictures and different kind of colors. And the reason why I'm mentioning all this is, I find it fascinating, for one, but also because it shows how in a text that lay dormant for such a very long time, you have a tradition or genre of literature or authors writing about the medical or psychosomatic benefits of colors and certain patterns. I've come across them discussing patterns, but I haven't come across the actual passages where they talk about patterns themselves. It requires a lot of archival research to find those other manuscripts and other texts. But the point is, in the most unexpected sources, one finds discussions on what we often refer to as aesthetics. This is the Bimaristan Nuri, and the extension was added in 1242 by Badr al-Din himself to the Bimaristan, and one of his texts he talks about the therapeutic effects of open spacious spaces like gardens, and about mountains and open spaces, etc. in general. So I would call this a sub-discipline or a genre of writing on its own. The second approach, and I'm running out of time very quickly, I timed this at home, but I'm running out of time. The second approach really looks at a particular author. And so there are many authors one can look at. So instead of a separate discipline or school of thought, one can really approach an author and see what that particular author has to say about color, perception, beauty, harmony, etc., etc. These are just a list of some authors one could explore. I think José Miguel Poeta Vilches recently, in a book several years ago, showed how many of these authors do indeed have their own aesthetic reflections or systems, if you will. And Oliver Leaman, in his book Islamic Aesthetics and Introduction, has a chapter called Philosophy and Ways of Seeing, in which he expounds upon an Ishraqi aesthetics and its possible links to Islamic art. That's quite promising. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. The third possible approach is thematic. And a case can be made for several important themes that seem to be central within the Islamic tradition that keep on popping up again and again. Beauty of God, intelligible versus sensible beauty, light, proportion and harmony. I think a case can be made for the psychology of beauty if one really is very careful how we define psychology. Of course, doesn't overlap with our contemporary understanding, but the effects of beauty on the soul. The theme of image imagination is definitely something that comes up again and again. I think this is one of the most neglected. Number 6 and number 7 are the most neglected so far in scholarship. The image and imagination and creativity. The human form, of course, the intermediary nature of geometry. It is also a topic that requires a lot of attention. And the vision and the gaze. I'm going to touch upon two very quickly. The issue of geometry, as I was mentioning earlier, is something that comes up again and again in Islamic discussions. But not just the idea of geometry as a practice, but geometry as somehow an intermediary or occupying an imaginal realm. One recent scholar, Thuman Khaliji, I believe, wrote a whole book on the role of these kind of architectural drawings and their fundamental role in imagining the design of buildings in Islamic tradition. But its views geometry lends itself well to a mystical and a logical understanding of geometry as a hoist for the imagination, for making the invisible visible. And these are drawings from that particular book in which he shows how these particular geometric drawings were meant to be perceived. The imaginative eye of the draftsman inhabits the drawing and makes connections between nodes of intersection and future visible lines. This idea of occupying or inhabiting the psychic space opened up by geometry is really interesting, as he explains in this particular quote here. In this view, the drawing starts from the domain of human imagination with the possibility of ascending to the realm of the intellect, while at the same time descending to the realm of the senses to guide the architect toward the built object. Seen this way, the imaginal drawing can offer an in-between state of being and becoming, a subtle matter, lighter than the building and denser than the idea, essentially representing a mode of consciousness involving the conscious imagination. I think he really opens up this issue and this field of exploration quite nicely in his book. I've come across literally 50, 60, 70 at least drawings, geometric drawings in the writings of Ibn Arabi. I'm doing my PhD on him. But the way in which he uses geometry is quite interesting and remarkable. He sees the imagination as liminal images that intermediaries between different realms of meaning, which once perceived activate the analogical or their anagogical or corresponding element in the higher realm. That's how he actually describes it. So it's quite interesting to explore this particular theme, which comes up again and again. And this theme cuts across various disciplines: mysticism, philosophy. It cuts across optics. It cuts across even with contemporary engagement with recent abstract art. The vision and the gaze is the last one I really want to touch upon very quickly. It's a theme and a topos that keeps on coming up again and again in the Islamic tradition. Despite the centrality of the intelligible, sensible beauty binary in medieval Islamic thought, beauty was often more seen as a living, moral, and psychological reality. Far from being merely a topic of intellectual conjecture, by far, most references to beauty speak of it as an objective, concrete, tangible, experiential, and living phenomenon of life with consequences for human well-being and the soul. Muslim theologians, philosophers, jurists, and mystics alike distinguish between different categories of pleasure evinced by beauty, depending on the instincts, the desires, and the aspects of the soul that it triggered, ranging from the appetitive to the spiritual, and from the material to the abstract. Muslim scholars also studied the various claims beauty makes on our visual capacities, and they distinguish, quite interestingly, between different kinds of vision, if you will. Vision proper, ru'ya, sight, hasat al-basar, and the gaze, nazar. Ru'ya refers to the capacity of the eye to perceive the divine, and it has well-developed theological, philosophical, and mystical contexts. Hasat al-basar, or sight, refers to the ability to see physically, and this was detailed and discussed by Muslim scientists like Ibn al-Haytham and Kamal ad-Din al-Farisi, while nazar, the gaze, is more than just the act of seeing, but has the psychological connotations of power and human will, and therefore was the subject of moral and ethical strictures. I couldn't come up with a better picture than this one, really. It's a very famous National Geographic. I'm not able to look at the picture directly. The gaze seems to just really overwhelm me. But I tried Googling gaze several times, and I always came up with this picture. It's a picture that I have in my National Geographic edition of this. But it's really a theme that comes up across the board in all the various disciplines in an Islamic tradition. And one could make a very convincing case that it is something that is present in all fields of investigation, whether it's philosophy or law or theology. Now, this approach, the approach of relying on themes, is quite difficult because it really presupposes that someone's done the work of the two first approaches. Either someone's really unearthed what a particular discipline or school of thought has said about something, or one has unearthed the writings of a particular author. Because to thematically explore, let's say, beauty or light and go digging through all the various sources is literally impossible, unless someone's actually presented those sources themselves. So it's a very difficult approach to adopt, but one can make a case for all these several themes as existing within the Islamic tradition. There are a number of contemporary approaches also, and I put them in a separate category. Oleg Grabar, with his reliance on psychoanalysis, Gonzalez with her reliance on phenomenology, Laura Marx with her Deleuzian ontology, and I'm doing some work with drawing on Einfühlung and German theory of empathy theory, really not so much to study the Islamic sources per se, but really I found the theories developed have significant overlap with some of the psychosomatic theories that I've come across in the medieval Islamic tradition. So I'm looking at ways of exploring parallels between them. But all these approaches have problems, insufficiently grounded in Islamic sources. They do not do justice to the way in which various fields are related to one another. And they're really approaches about Islamic philosophy or Islamic theology, and are not really using the categories of these fields to think through the questions themselves. We often say, Ibn Khaldun or Ibn Rushd or Ibn al-Haytham said this and this and this and this, but we're very reluctant to use their own conceptual categories of thought to think through the issues raised by Ibn Haytham, for example, and to think and reflect upon our contemporary engagement with aesthetic questions, which is the more interesting field of investigation for myself. I find, in retrospect, my approach can be called nomadic, and I'm about to explain this in a second. What I mean by nomadic is, and I've taken this really definition from Tim Rainer, it's a way of being and involves refusing to be tied down by set categories and definitions. So although I adopted a particular approach or a particular definition of aesthetics, what I found eventually is that although it is useful for heuristic purposes, for exploring the material and helping structure my thoughts, at the end of the day I came out the other end without a notion of aesthetics at all. It was something entirely different. Let me give you an example very quickly. I have 2 minutes left. For example, if I were to start with the notion of creativity, and it would be something I have done. These are actual maps of my current research. I found profound links between al-ibda', creativity, and the notion of the himma in certain literature, the relationship between creativity and bodily movements and gestures, the relationship between creativity and a divine word, because in a lot of the context of doing Islamic art, the divine word is constantly invoked. The fundamental role of the imagination and the image. But then, if I look at the notion of vision and the gaze, for example, it's related to the issue of basar, seeing, ru'ya, seeing God, nazar, which is the gaze. It's also linked to hawa, which is the passions. And you can see above how the theme, vision and the gaze, is linked to a discipline of Islamic jurisprudence on the gaze, or optics, which is also linked to the author Ibn al-Haytham. And you can see the optics popping up there as a field of investigation below there, and then Ibn al-Haytham as an author there. It links up with the notion, if you go from ru'ya, the vision of God, it links up with the notion of imagination and creativity, which is and himma and bodily movements and divine word. Divine word is linked to calligraphy. And I found this way of investigating the material quite interesting, because what this particular, so bodily movements links up with philosophies of the body and corporeality in the Islamic tradition, and that links up with the idea of notion of beauty. If you look up on the lower left-hand side, you can see beauty pops up there, and its relationship to natural beauty and spiritual beauty and divine beauty. And what this kind of maze or spiderweb showing you is literally the way I actually engage in the research themselves. And what I found is, according to the approach I've adopted, that this approach allows me to start from multiple centers, constantly move around from theme to theme or topic to topic or issue to issue. It allows me to, although I might highlight the issue of vision and the related themes to it or the related ideas to this field of research, although this stands out in the foreground and the background, I never lose sight of the fact that it's linked to various other issues and questions in the actual field of investigation. And I found this particular image quite useful in explaining the differences between these particular approaches, because if we were to look at the approach of looking at the discipline or school of thought, or looking at a particular author, we find that although it provides a certain center, it excludes other possible ways of linking the material together. The thematic and the contemporary approaches, although they provide multiple centers of investigation, they don't really provide a link between all the other themes. I found the issue of this nomadic, distributed network of nodes interconnecting with one another allows me to start with the notion of Islamic aesthetics, only to discover later that in the broader context of philosophical, theological, and other disciplines, it opens up to other fields of investigation like metaphysics. And although I started with a certain definition of Islamic aesthetics, it allows me to structure my investigation, but ultimately to become liberated from this narrow definition. And working with students, and I have to emphasize this particular, working with students in a pedagogical context, I find this particular approach very useful. I wouldn't necessarily suggest it as a philosophical posture on Islamic aesthetics or the field of Islamic aesthetics in general. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully it's raised a number of issues in the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you.